Right then guys, it's PSL here, and I'm here for the second episode in my Power Stages series on Dirt 4. Now, having established in the previous video that the Opel Adam is pretty much 3 seconds faster than the Ford Fiesta around Kangaroo Farm, we're moving on to what I would suspect are the only two cars in the game that are slower than the R2 cars. They are the H1 cars that include the Austin Mini Cooper S and the Lancia Fulvia. Two quite different cars with relatively different designs from two different countries and two different decades. So we'll start off with what is potentially my favourite rally car ever. Well, I'm not so sure about that actually, because I always loved the Subaru Impreza, and the Ford Focus rally cars were always quite good, and the Group B cars were interesting, like the Audi Quattros. But you know what? I still slightly prefer the Mini over those legendary cars that I've just mentioned, the Imprezas, Focuses, Quattros, Delta Integrales of the rally world. Because the Mini Cooper, it's such a plucky, small, surprisingly successful car. Because it was such a differently designed rally car, nothing like anything else it really competed against. And that's why the Mini Cooper, thanks to its lightweight, short wheelbase, won 3 Monte Carlo rallies from 1964 to 1967. That's hardly surprising though. Its rapid acceleration and brilliant manoeuvrability are the exact characteristics you need to win the Monte Carlo rally. However, we're not at Monte Carlo, we're in Kangaroo Farm, and whilst those characteristics will certainly be helpful, you can also do with a boot full of horsepower, which this car doesn't really have. It has the least horsepower of any rally car in this game, 100 horsepower, but that doesn't necessarily mean it will be the slowest. As I said, it's very light, very manoeuvrable, and those characteristics will still be useful here. It's just really a question of how much of a disadvantage its lack of power is going to be.
Five, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
Thanks for the countdown, Nicky, and away we go. And we're going to start off with this incredibly long but bumpy straight. And unfortunately, this is going to be the Mini's downfall. Its straight line speed. It's only got 100 horsepower, and we'll have a look at the speed it gets up to. It's already in top gear, 4th gear, and it just reached 90 miles an hour there, but that was when it's in the air. There you go once again. So it's on 87 miles an hour. I think we just saw 88 miles an hour. There you go, 88 miles an hour. If this was a DeLorean, we'd be time traveling. And I honestly think that's what the Mini needs to get a good stage time here, is time travel. Because it just really isn't all that great in a straight line, although under braking, turning, acceleration, quite good. I mean, let's not forget, this is a car from the 60s. This is not really a rally car, essentially. It was never meant to be a rally car. It's not like an Audi Quattro, which was designed for this purpose. This is just a small, economical, British-built car, and, you know, and it just happened to be good at a Monte Carlo rally. It's iconic, it's not massively quick. But, I mean, we'll have a look at it through some of these sweeping, narrower sections, and, I mean, we're still full throttle. I mean, that's the thing with the Mini, is yes, it only gets up to 88 miles an hour, but, I mean, there we're, you know, tight to the wall there, took the shortest possible line around that corner, and that's the brilliant thing, is it doesn't go all that quickly. A bit of understeer there, maybe I went slightly too hot into that corner, but throughout this entire stage, I was pretty much full throttle. 80% of this stage, I would say, was done at full throttle. Once again, tight to the inside line. It doesn't go all that quickly, but it's got more than enough grip. More than enough. You could argue you don't go fast enough to be able to exceed the level of grip, but to me, this is what a perfectly well-designed car is. A car which, you know, has good acceleration, great handling, and it's just impossible to ever lose control or crash because you just never run out of grip. We'll have a look, because we got to now break down into here, into this downhill 2-corner, and again it handled it brilliantly. And this has been a test under braking, because you got to brake whilst going around a right-hander to instantly go left. But then, you know, that was a tight hairpin corner. That's exactly what the Mini was brilliant at. That's why it was so successful at Monaco, was handling the hairpins and accelerating quickly out of them. It's been, what's the word, a chirpy lap, I guess is a good way to describe it. sort of like the Fiesta and the Adam in a sense, because I guess they're kind of modern day equivalents of, you know, small, not too powerful cars. You know, the lap hasn't been rapid, but it's been sprightly, certainly. It's been sort of similar to the Opel Adam, in the sense that, you know, the acceleration has certainly been there. Unfortunately, the Mini, it just maxes out incredibly quickly. And going around this corner, this is again one of the more difficult sections, but again, hanging tight to the inside line. So, the Mini physically, without tuning it, without extending the gear ratios, it physically can't have gone any quicker, because as I said, I was full throttle throughout all of that. You know, it was such an easy lap as well, because you just never ran out of grip. Such an easy lap, such a fun lap. Unfortunately, not massively quick, as we end the stage there at 3 minutes 21.5. I know I said lap towards the end there, but that's just force of habit with me being primarily an F1 YouTuber. But no, the stage time there, 3 minutes 21.5 seconds from the plucky Mini Cooper. 3 minutes and 21.521 seconds. That's 14 seconds slower than the Ford Fiesta we saw in the previous episode, and even 17 seconds slower than the Opel Adam. Although it should be pointed out that this car is by far the easiest car to drive in the game. You just never run out of grip, you never exceed the levels of grip, although you never really go fast enough to be able to run out of grip, and I think unfortunately that is this car's biggest issue. Let's move the discussion away from the amount of horsepower it has and just how well it handled. And it handled brilliantly. There was almost never any understeer. There was never oversteer, never any drifting really out of the corner that I didn't deliberately instigate. It just did exactly what I wanted it to do, or at no point did I feel out of control. And also I should point out that while the top end speed wasn't there, the acceleration out of the corners was there, and I'm sure if you alter the gear ratios you could get a quicker time because you could increase the top speed, but then that would harm the acceleration, and this car's acceleration was brilliant considering the lack of horsepower this car has, considering its age, considering everything. The acceleration was pretty good, although you kind of would expect that from a car which is very light. And the final defense for the Mini is that it is by far in a way the oldest car in the game. So you can't really expect too much from it, and you can't really compare it to anything else of the time, of the era. There isn't really a direct comparison from the same decade, from the 1960s. The only car we can really fairly compare it to is the only other car in the game in the same class as the Mini, which is the Lancia Fulvia. Statistically, both cars are very similar. Both are incredibly light front-wheel drive cars with around 100 horsepower. However, the Fulvia is 8 years more modern than the Mini. However, on the flip side, it's 1 metre longer than the Mini Cooper, and even the wheelbase is 30 centimetres longer than the Mini's wheelbase. It gets worse for the Lancia as well, as while it has 15 horsepower than the Mini, its power to weight ratio is worse. The Mini weighs just under 300 pounds less than the Lancia, or 0.1 tonnes once converted into a measurement of weight that actually means something to me. So once you do that, once you convert the weight, that means that the Mini's power to weight ratio is 149.2 horsepower per tonne. The Lancia, despite having 15 more horsepower, is 3.7 horsepower per tonne down on the Mini at 145.5 horsepower per tonne. This doesn't necessarily spell the end to the Lancia's hopes though. It may be longer, wider and heavier and have a worse horsepower to weight ratio. It still has more outright horsepower. The Mini couldn't go above 88 miles an hour, and it lost an extraordinary amount of time being limited by its own engine, and if the Lancia can just go noticeably faster in a straight line, as long as it's comparable in the rest of the stage, it should average out as quicker. Theoretically at least, that does rely on the Fulvia being quicker in a straight line and being similar, maybe slightly better, maybe slightly worse. It should be worse than the Mini around corners. It's heavier, it's longer, it's got a longer wheelbase importantly. So, looking at it logically, the Mini has the edge, but at this particular stage, with so many high-speed sections, including that massive, long but bumpy straight, the Fulvia could just get the edge over the Mini.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
Thanks again, Nicky, and away we go here at Kangaroo Farm. So importantly, what speed can the Fulvia get up to? The Mini only ever got to 88 miles an hour. The Fulvia has still only got 4 gears, but it's in 4th gear now, going over the bridge, and let's have a look at the speed, where it's already into the 80 miles an hour. Over the air it said 93 miles an hour, but that's obviously not accurate, that's a fake speed. Let's have a look, it's 91 miles an hour? 91 miles an hour it maxed out there, so it's only 3 miles an hour quicker in a straight line, and there's a car actually broken down on the side. That is actually another Lancia Fulvia. A bad omen is all I'm going to say. I mean, we know Lancia, I mean, I've seen Top Gear, I know Lancias didn't have brilliant reliability, but yeah, that really isn't a great omen for the Lancia. So it was quick on a straight line though. It has the edge at the moment, so now we need to pay attention to it around these corners. And it's still doing alright, a little bit of kick out from the rear end there. That's the problem with the car. Well, it's a combination of it being longer and heavier, is you're going to get the back of the car stepping out if it isn't perfectly balanced. It's not, I mean, it's nothing like some of the other cars we've seen. I mean, I'd argue it's even actually, you know, like slightly less noticeable than the 2 cars we saw in the previous episode. It's it's not quite as easy to drive as the Mini, because you may notice, I mean, even around this corner, got off the throttle, I think I even got on the brake there actually to try and avoid understeering. It's, the thing of the Fulvia is it is a great handling car, but comparing it to the Mini was brilliant, we were full throttle all the time. Whereas here we're having to get out the throttle more often, brake more often than the Mini. It's just not doing as well. I mean, the Fulvia is still tight around there. Slightly lost it on the end of that, but I think that was more my mistake than the car there, to be honest. Although, you could argue that the car, because the rear end stepped out slightly, which the Mini, it couldn't do. The Mini doesn't really have a rear end. And also, the Fulvia, I don't know if it's just me, it just feels slightly more sluggish. I'm not sure if the acceleration is slower, but it just feels that way. I mean, we'll have a look, because, hang on, under braking into this tight hairpin, again, it broke fine, but coming out, again, it just doesn't really feel like it's moving as quickly as the Mini. It's got more horsepower, but it's got more weight. Its power-to-weight ratio is less. Again, we were in 2nd gear for a long time there. It's, it may be, I mean, it feels slower in acceleration. I'm not 100% sure if that is the case. It wouldn't surprise me if it was. But also the problem is, as we'll see for these sweeping sections, no, we won't actually, but what I was going to try and say is that the rear end does occasionally step out. So you can't just full throttle it through every single corner. The low speed corners, the Fulvia actually handles quite similarly to the Mini. We'll see around here. Again, it's still tight to the wall there, much like the Mini. Low speed corners, it handles exactly the same, but the medium to high speed corners, the Fulvia is just not quite as great, because you can't trust it. You don't have the confidence, because you're always worried it's going to step out. Although, having a look though, Alvarez is miles behind. We're much further ahead of Alvarez than we were in the Mini, and actually, it's quite, wow, that is interesting. We were miles ahead of Alvarez, I mean, it was slower than the Mini, 5 seconds slower than the Mini, just less than, but Alvarez was much slower this time around than he was when we were in the Mini. The Lancia Fulvia stage time there was 3 minutes and 26.139 seconds. That's 4.6 seconds slower than the Mini stage time, and that was a given within half of the stage that the Fulvia was going to be slower than the Mini. It just became blatantly obvious. The Fulvia, yes, it was marginally quicker in a straight line. It reached 91 miles an hour with its extra 15 horsepower, when the Mini could only get up to 88 miles an hour. Of course, the top speeds both of those cars achieved on this stage could have been bettered if you altered the gear ratios, but this series is just testing the cars as standard, and as standard, the top speeds were 88 and 91 miles an hour respectively. And I mentioned this whilst on the Fulvia stage, and that's just that I'm not sure whether the Lancia accelerated slower, but it certainly felt that way. It felt more sluggish. The Fulvia seemed to stuck in 2nd gear for an awful long time. It had a really long first and second gear, it's almost like it was turbocharged in the sense that the acceleration came later on because it had a long first couple of gears, especially second gear. Basically, it was ratioed in a slightly odd way. I also mentioned about the loose rear end on the Fulvia. Now, it's not a case that the Fulvia is extremely difficult to drive. It's not. It's just that we're comparing this car to the Mini, and the Mini had no rear end. There was never any oversteer. The Fulvia was very easy to drive. Maybe the most difficult car I've had to drive in this series so far, but trust me, you should see some of the cars we got coming up later on. And in the grand scheme of things, this Fulvia was relatively easy to drive. It was more difficult than the Mini. It had less rear end grip than the Mini, and I'd honestly say that the Fulvia, if it was the same length as the Mini, it would probably be quicker, because a lot of the time it lost, it wasn't even through the rear end stepping out. That in of itself didn't really lose the Fulvia that much time. The thing that cost the Fulvia time is the fact that I knew that the rear end could step out. With the Mini, around some of the more medium and higher speed corners, I knew you just had to full throttle it, maybe ease off the power, and that was it. It was dead easy. The Fulvia might well have been quicker. Certainly once it got up to speed, it was definitely quicker. But there were more times where I had to get off the power or brake heading into corners because I couldn't trust the rear end. I just couldn't, because I just knew that it could step out, and if it did step out in a big way, then that's an awful lot of time to lose. It's not a case that the Mini was necessarily quicker around the corners, it was just that you had complete confidence that you could chuck the Mini into any corner at any speed and have complete confidence that it wouldn't bite you. The Lancia was the more interesting car to drive of the two of them, and it certainly requires more skill to drive quickly than the Mini, because when you drive the Mini, all you have to do is just hold your foot down on the accelerator constantly. The Lancia Fulvia is easily the prettiest of the two cars here, but unfortunately, in pretty much every other way, the Mini is better.